want to love him more. I want to love him more. I want to love him more. He did so very much for me. I want to love him more. The story ever sweeter grows, how on the cross he bore my sins, and by his stripes I'm healed. I want to love him more. I want to love him more. I want to love him more. He did so very much for me. I want to love him more. Oh, how he suffered on the tree. No love like that before. I know and feel I love him yet. I want to love him more. I want to love him more. I want to love him more. He did so very much for me. I want to love him more.
Good morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the song of consecration we just sang. Lord, it is our desire that we love you more each day. Lord, I don't know if there's any way you could love us more than you already do, and you already demonstrated. But what you did for us on the cross, and not even what you do for us today, you're still in heaven entreating for us. Lord, I just pray that as we look at these spiritual disciplines this morning again, I pray that we would see in them not just the loss or the discipline that doesn't necessarily come easy for us, but we would see a way of expressing our love to you more. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, after today, I think I have one more message yet on the spiritual disciplines, but it was a good practice for me again to be studying these again. To what are some of the things that we can be disciplining ourselves to do or not to do, so that we can experience more of Christ in our lives. So today we're going to be looking at I'm going to be looking at two aspects at the beginning: sacrificial living and giving, which are disciplines that we need to discipline ourselves to do. And the third one is submission. And so to start with this morning, I'd like to turn to Mark chapter 12. And I'm actually going to be combining the sacrificial living, which is a proactive, or which is a choosing to abstain from some things, and sacrificial giving is something we discipline ourselves to do. One is disciplining ourselves to do without, one is disciplining ourselves to do. But they're so closely tied together, I'm going to kind of address them together this way. So I want to start by going to Mark chapter 12, and we're going to start in verse 41. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury, and so children, as you think about that, there's a room here. I'm preaching on one side of the room, that's the opposite side of the room. So Jesus was sitting somewhere on the other side from the treasury, and he's sitting there watching. Kind of like if you ever go to the mall, you watch people when they're walking around the mall. People watching is interesting. You see how people react, they relate to each other, sort of things. So Jesus is sitting there with his disciples, and they're watching. Okay, so that's the setting. And they saw how people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Now, we use paper money here, so you don't necessarily hear, and we put checks in there. You know, a check, as I have seen, can be anywhere from, I had someone write out a check for $1.50 in the front of the store, and I had someone write out a check for $35,000. You know, these are both checks, you know, and one little piece of paper can mean a lot of money or little. Well, that's not how they had money back then. They had monies in coins. Now, children, if you have coins in your pocket, what do they do when you run? Yeah. they jingle, don't they? You know, and so sometimes you have little children with have some money in their pocket. They put it in their hand there. You know, they like to hear the sound of that tinkle. Well, that is what, when they had coins back then, if you're going to bring in a lot of money, what's that going to sound like when you put that into the treasury chest? You know, it's kind of like if you take all your coins to the bank and they dump them in that big machine, and it comes out with all the proper change of the amount that's there. It's kind of a little bit like that noise. Well, some of the rich people would come in, and they would have maybe a whole sack full of coins. Away they go in. That's kind of the story. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrant. So if I'm understanding it, 2 mites is about the smallest form of money they would have. Okay? What's the smallest form of money we have here in America? A penny. Yes. So she came in and she brought in 2 pennies. Okay? And Jesus called to his disciples and said to them, "Assuredly, I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than all of those who have given to the treasury." Does that make sense financially? That doesn't make sense, does it? How could she, putting in 2 pennies, were worth those who put in thousands? Worth more than that. Hear what Jesus says. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. And there's several things that stand out to me about this passage here. You know, it's not the size of the gift that matters. It's the heart of sacrifice that's giving it. You know, the others gave out of their abundance. And they gave a lot. But their giving did not demonstrate at all their need or their trust in God. They just simply gave of their excess. But she didn't have any excess. And in wanting to show her love to God and wanting to show her willingness to God, she felt led, whatever, to give everything that she had. You know, and it's the heart that gives out of their need that demonstrates the sacrificial nature we're talking about here today. I am 99.98575% certain that she could have used that money for some needs in her own life. Okay? They didn't have Social Security back then. Social Security was the temple, and it wasn't exactly a safe place to trust. Social Security isn't either, just to get that all out and clear. I'm sure she could have used that for something that in her life, but she instead chose to give it to God. And as I was studying this morning, I thought about, remember when Elijah was sent, when there was no rain for 3 years, and God sent him to a widow. God has a special spot for widows. And I keep thinking about Edna right now. You know, God has a special spot in his heart for them. God sent Elijah to a widow woman. Now, she was not a Hebrew widow woman. She was a Sidonian. She was from the enemy country, if you will. And God said, Elijah, I want you to go up to there. I have a widow woman who prepared to help you. So he goes up there and he finds this woman gathering sticks. And he says, do you have a drink of water and some food? And she said, I'll give you some water. She said, but all I have is just a little bit of meal that me and my son are going to make it and eat it and then die. And Elijah said to her, go ahead and make it, but bring it here to me first. Let me eat of it first. Now, does that sound like a good leader tactic? Did she have anything to fall back on? No. But she somehow chose to believe in a God enough, not even her own gods necessarily, the gods of the Hebrews, she believed in them enough to go make the very last food she had. And she offered it to the man of God first. And God says, because you've done that, the cruse of oil will not fail, will not empty, and the meal will not fail until it was over. And it didn't. You know, and I think it stands out to me as God notices those who cast themselves wholly on him. He notices that. God is not blind to those things. You may feel like I'm not really that big of a person. I'm pretty certain that widow woman, not even in Israel, had probably a lower ranking in her mind than you do. And God noticed her. And I still wonder, I want to find out in heaven someday, God, why did you choose her? Is it because there was more faith in her to do what she did than there was with anyone else in Israel? I mean, we find that happening with the centurion. He had more faith than anyone else in who Jesus was in Israel. So, talking about, I'd like to look at sacrificial living. Sacrificial living is basically this: to forsake the security of meeting our needs with what is in our hands. There is a real tendency to try and protect ourselves from the troubles of this life by stockpiling up a little or a lot for a rainy day. We were down at, I was down at the coordinators conference for the SAR team, and our team is the poorest team in the whole organization. We have the least money of anybody, and we go in the longest searches of anybody because we have a lot more wilderness up here. And so it was just interesting looking at some of those things. And I remember one of the other coordinators saying, well, they like to keep a stockpile, or they like to keep a little bit of a hedge fund. I back up. One of the things that Cam is saying, look, if you have a huge bank account, we're going to ask you to reimburse some of the search expenses from your own account, rather than looking to Cam to replace those like Cam normally does for us. And some of them said, "Oh, wait just a minute. What's a significant amount?" Because some people think that for a rainy day you need to have enough, and other people say, no, for a rainy day you need to have enough, and it's just a different perspective in that. And sacrifice is to say, I choose to turn away from finding my security for a rainy day in what I have in my hands, but choosing to let God, not to say that we don't use that to meet our needs, but that we don't hold that to ourselves as a guarding against those days. Does that make sense? Let me explain more about it this way. This sacrifice we're talking about is a total abandonment to God. Think about Abraham. Abraham had been promised a son, right? And then we know that God gave him Isaac miraculously, from a 90-year-old woman. None of you know a 90-year-old woman, anyone that's even could begin to have a child. If my mom told me that she's expecting the child, I would have lots of questions trying to figure out what's going on here. But she did. And so then God asked Abraham, I want you to go up and I want you to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. There's no way that you can only half sacrifice something and still expect it, and still have it a true sacrifice expected to come back. Sacrifice meant death. And Abraham had to get to the place where he was totally abandoning himself, his hopes, his dreams, his promises to God. He was totally giving it to him. So practically, what does that look like? Well, it's this. If you get paid for your work and you only have 3 days of food in your house, and God asks you to take that money and give it to someone else in his name, sacrifice says you do that. That sacrifice. It might be, the need might be in India, it might be in Iran, it might be in Minneapolis, it might be someone else in your own church. But if God is prompting you to do that, even though you may not see how it's all going to work out, you still follow and you do it. Not because it's easy, but because you're willing to trust God in His leading and His ability to provide for you. It's trusting and saying, God, if you're asking me to give this away, you've also promised that you're going to provide for my needs. I trust you enough to sacrifice this to you. You know, Matthew 6 talks about that. He says, if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is covered with snow, how much more will He clothe you? I was down there in St. Louis yesterday or Friday, and it was 84 degrees down there. And you walk out there and you smell the grass growing. Someone had mowed just a little bit, and I just wanted to, we're not going to have that for 2 months yet, And it was just a little rough to think about going back to snow. Well, I came back to brown. But to see the grass growing down there, it's just like, and you know what? They could be covered with snow tomorrow. It could, I don't know if what the weather says, but they could still get snow down there. If God cares enough for the grass to protect it amidst all of the heat of summer, the drought of winter, freezing, thawing, and He cares enough about the world to do that for grass, how much more does He care for you? We were talking about this in our team leadership meeting, or we were just gathered together talking about this. Does God need your money? Not really. If He owns the cattle of the 1,000 hills and He owns the hills, does He need your money? No. But He needs your heart. And that's demonstrated by the way we use our money. Is it smart to do what I just talked about by giving that away? No, not in this earthly sense. Is it common sense? No, it's not common sense. Common sense is I hang on and make sure I can provide for everything here first. Is it financially prudent? Would Dave Ramsey tell you to do that? Nope, probably not. You need to, I heard that at one time you needed to have like $350,000 or $400,000 saved up before you could live off the interest and dividends off of that. Well, from what I understand now, it's up over close to about 1.2 to 1.4 million you need to have saved up and put away if you're going to be able to live because of inflation and everything else like that. It's not financially prudent to live sacrificially. Is it biblical? At times, yes. At times, yes. God will not ask us of that every day. But we need to be willing to do it if He asks. I was talking with a dear friend of mine that he was saying, well, Japheth, is it okay to save up for a house? He said, we're looking at, their farm is getting a stage. They're realizing that in 10 to 15 years, they're not going to be on the farm anymore. Is it okay to save up that money to try and build a house? Yes. But what if God wants to touch the money? Do we let it go? Well, God, I'm saving it for this. Yes, but someone else's house burned down. I'd like you to give $20,000 of that to help them. Are we willing to do that? And I think that answer to that question tells us where our trust really lies, whether we're willing to live sacrificially or not. God may test us by asking. And I was mulling this over this morning again. I thought about last summer with the decision to put our house up for sale, to possibly look at buying mats and moving out there. I really wonder, I don't know why God took us through that ringer, but was it to see if we were really willing to let go? I don't know. It was just a question of us. Sacrifices also, I want to give a word of warning here. If we let me back up. I just said sacrifice is, and I didn't read my notes here well enough. I want to give a warning here about living sacrificially. If we practice sacrifice for spiritual merit or to gain divine favor, we're on a dangerous path of destroying our faith. We should be doing these things out of love for God and because He calls us to, not to try and gain a little level up or try to somehow make ourselves more valuable to God. Because that's not how God works. Remember I talked about 2 weeks ago what God's been taking me through, when he asked, is there any way I could demonstrate that I love you more than I already have? And I don't know that he can. He has done everything we need. He's given his own life. He's not only given his life, he's walked with us. It's one thing to say I'll die for you. It's another thing to say I'll live for you, because that's an ongoing process. And God has already said, I will do that for you. And so we dare not try to use this to gain merit with it. True biblical sacrifice is having a relationship with God so close that all I have is available to him, and being willing to use it for him or others' purposes if he asks that. Think of it like this. We have one checkbook at our house. We have a home banking account or a home checking account, and because my wife usually pays some of the bills and stuff when she does paperwork, she keeps that in her purse, and I go looking for that when I want to find it. But we both have access to the same checking account. Think about that's what this is. Is God on your checking account? Is he a signer on your checks? Does he have the ability to take the checkbook out of your pocketbook and write out a check? Now, he's not physically going to do that. But if he prompts you to do that, will we listen? If I tell my wife, I said, honey, I'd like us to write out a check for this amount, and she goes, I don't think so. There's not enough here for me to do what I want to do with it after that, so I don't want to do that. Would we have a problem? There would be a conflict. There would be a struggle. Do we live sacrificially for God? The other aspect of this is giving. So living sacrificially is doing without or choosing to give away in sacrifice. But this part is giving is choosing to be on the giving end of it that way. In the Old Testament, what percentage were the children of Israel required to give to the temple? 10%. Okay? It's kind of been a standard ever since then. Do they wait till it's all done and then take 10% and give it to the temple? No. In fact, when they were supposed to bring it in was usually at the beginning of harvest. Shortly after, when the cream of the crop was coming in, there was a feast day that they were supposed to be coming in and bringing in the 10%. So I don't know of any other illustration other than this one to think about as far as how this made an impact to me. We used to have a strawberry patch. And you watch those berries come up in the spring, and you see those, they get really big, and they start getting red, and you start scoping out where the biggest ones are in the patch. And, you bite into them, and the juice kind of runs down your chin a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? Are those the same berries you get at the end of the season? So how do you know what 10% is? Somehow, the question is going to come out through your heart and what you choose to give. If you give the first 10%, you're giving the best to God. And somehow it's a way of saying, I'm going to choose to give this to you, and I'm going to trust you to provide the rest of it, what I need. And that's what it was. We choose to do it. That's what they were supposed to. Well, we're not under the Old Testament law, so we don't have to give 10%. But the giving is what's supposed to teach us that. Now, let me back up. What is the giving supposed to teach us? It's supposed to teach us where it comes from and to remind us of that. And we're not giving it in to kind of like prime the pump so that we can turn it on and get a whole bunch more later. That's not what giving is supposed to do. Some people say that and some people teach that. That's not what Jesus is saying here. But if we only give a tiny percentage, do we really learn or understand what God is trying to show us and when he asks us to give? Giving is returning to God his resources by my voluntary choice. I don't have to do it. In the Old Testament, it was required. It's not necessarily required, but what does my giving reflect on my heart? Do I have a generous heart towards God? Do I cheerfully choose to do this, or do I grudgingly, oh, the offering plate comes around and so watches and they see if I put something in or not. And I better put something in. You know, I have been one time where I got a fake check folded up and put in there. And I don't know if it was a little person that put it in or if someone else felt that they had to put something in just to look like they put something in. I don't know. This was not here. It was elsewhere. But I'm just saying, it makes me ask that question. Do I do it cheerfully? And do I do it according to how God has prospered me? Giving reflects the faith in God's continual provision, hand in hand with sacrifice. I remember back shortly after we were married, we were facing some tough financial times. And there was a temptation, I'm not sure that we have enough really to pay tithe and meet some of these needs. And I will just say there was a couple of weeks sometimes where we pushed it off for a few weeks. We'll make that up. Do you know how hard that is to make that up? And it's interesting. Over those next few weeks, things just didn't work like we had planned. We never got ahead. We never made that. And yet, when we have given to the Lord as He has prospered, I have never yet found it quite that tight. There's always been enough. And we've always been able to afford our tithe. Giving should be systematic or systemic. Both planned, that's why we gather the offering every Sunday morning, but there's also spontaneous giving. And that's the thing where, sometimes as you're praying, maybe the Lord brings someone to mind. You know what? I wonder what they're facing. And can I help them out in that way? I remember shortly after Amy's cancer surgery, I say it was about 6 months, maybe 8 months after the cancer surgery, someone came up to me after church and they said, "How are you coming along on your hospital bill?" I said, "Well, we still got about just a little bit over $3,000 to go yet." And he said, "Okay, just curious." And later that evening, just going to walk out the door, he slipped something in my shirt pocket. He said, He said, "I just want to give this to you in the name of the Lord." I got home. It was $3,300. And that was spontaneous. I don't think there was anything else. There was no a church offering taken. There was nothing else like that. It was just somehow God prompted him to help in that way. In a nutshell, the union of sacrificial living and giving is this. It's living simply so that others can simply live. It really boils down to that. And allowing God to give the direction in that. Merle Burkholder tells a story of down in Haiti, and I've told this here before, but I just want to insert this here quickly again. It was at the beginning of the rainy season, but they're planting crops, but most of the people, they're planting their food. The food that they would normally eat, they're instead going and putting in the ground because it's seed for them to hopefully get a harvest later. But now they don't have the food and they don't have the harvest yet. And there was a lot of people that are very hungry. And Pastor Paul got up that morning and he said, "I know that some of you do not have any lunch to go home to. And it's easier to sing than it is to sit at home and not have anything to eat. So we're going to have a song service this afternoon until the evening service. And those of you who want to stay can stay, and we'll sing the afternoon." And almost half the congregation stayed. And Merle sat there, and he all of a sudden was just smoten in his heart. How many of us here in America sit down to big, luscious meals, probably more, and eat more food than we should on a Sunday? And down there, his children are choosing to sing praises to God in the midst of a hungry belly. He said, "I wonder what goes through the heart of God when he sees that." Now, granted, you just go take a whole bunch of money down there and give that. That's not necessarily going to be helpful. But it makes me ask the question, are we being sensitive to the needs that God has placed around us. So what are the results if we practice sacrificial living and giving? Well, it nourishes faith in God, both in ourselves and those we give to, and sometimes even to those who happen to see the gift. I'm just going to try and tell. I have a few stories to share this morning, but it's just and some of you have heard these stories before. Some of you have not, or you've grown up a lot since then. But shortly after we were married, my wife had ovarian cancer before we met, and shortly after we were married, we found out we're joyfully expecting a baby. That was what does that cost? Well, I called the hospital. It was going to be between $6,000 to $7,000 for a non-complicated birth. By the way, right now it's between $22,000 to $30,000 for a non-complicated birth, and at the hospital. And so I was looking at that. That was over a fourth of my income for a year. And I was like, how are we going to be able to afford that? With everything else that we got going, I don't know, but we're going to try. At our second prenatal, they found a lump on my wife's neck, and the doctor said, I want that checked out. You've had a history of cancer. I want to make sure that's not thyroid cancer. And so on Valentine's Day, we went in and did an ultrasound to try and see if they could see what it was, and couldn't see anything. And they said, we're going to do a biopsy. Those hurt. But they did a biopsy, and that came back with inconclusive. But it was our first Valentine's Day together, and that's what we were doing on our Valentine's Day. It was great fun. But I was like, how am I going to pay for this? I knew that there were almost 1,000. I called, what's this going to cost? And back then it was a lot easier now to find out what things cost. I was able to call the coding office and say, this is what we're doing. They said, well, here's what your bill's going to be. And it was going to be right around $1,000. And we had about $175, $150 to our name in our checking account. That was it. And we had to replace our stove because the other one almost burnt our house down. It was crazy. We were trying to do that and juggle. How are we supposed to do this? And I remember my boss telling me, Japheth, this is what Minnesota Care is there for. I mean, you can't be expected to afford everything that happens to you. It's there for people who are poor getting started to support you in this, so you don't have to carry this burden the rest of your life. And so I went home and talked to my wife. I said, sweetheart, what do you think we should do? And she said, honey, I'll let that up to you, but I trust you to follow the Lord's promptings. Well, I started doing my thinking. God gave me a head on my shoulders, right? You should be thinking through some of these things. And so I looked at it and said, does it make sense to go deeply into debt for this child and potentially surgery here, or to pay $75 a month and have those things completely taken care of? Well, from a fiscal standpoint, that's a no-brainer. It's called a duhism. And I just looked at it and said, you know what? God expects me to use the knowledge that I have, and so to do this, and so I'm going to sign up for Minnesota Care. And it was about, and so we did that. And this is right over the time when we went in for the testing. It was about a week later. I was working in the shop with Daddy, and he mentioned to me, he said, son, I heard that you signed up for Minnesota Care. And I want you to know that I don't think that what you did was sin. I don't think there was anything technically wrong with it. But he said it does disappoint a little bit because we never had anyone to show us what a life lived of faith looks like. We didn't have anyone, we heard about it, but we had no one demonstrate to us how you actually avail yourself of the grace of God, how you walk in faith when it comes to finances. And he said, we hope that by giving you children the testimony and the experiences we did, that you'd be able to take that and go on and grow further. I went back to lunch that day. So I walked back to the little house where Neil's at now. And, the sun was shining, but my heart was heavy. Did I do the right thing? And I went back and I said, I just, out of the blue, said, sweetheart, if this was completely up to you, would you have this insurance? And she said, oh, absolutely not. Okay, rookie husband mistake number one, What? I thought you said she said, I trusted you. Whatever God guides you to do, I'm going to stand with you, but I wouldn't have it. I said, well, why not? And she said, from my experiences when I've been with people, and she listed a few scenarios, whenever something went wrong, one of the first questions was, is our insurance paid up? Oh, I'm glad we got the insurance paid because we couldn't afford that bill. And she said, then I went and lived with another family for a while, and they chose to trust God with their finances. And she said, I watched the family when they had an unexpected emergency or something. I watched the family gather around and they prayed, Lord, would you provide for us? And when they needed a new piece of equipment for their jam making business, it was a very expensive thing. It was like, how are we going to do that? The family started praying for it. Lord, would you bring in the funds? And God brought in the funds, and they were able to buy that thing debt-free. And she said, if I had my choice, I'd rather see our children develop a faith and a trust in a Father who provides for them than an insurance thing. And that just smote my heart because I realized that it was easy for me to say that I trusted God with things that were completely beyond my control out there. But if I could put my finger on the needle, I was going to do it my way. And it also made me ask the question, why is it easier for me to trust the promises of man's institutions than it is to trust the promises of God that he's given to me? And it was at that moment that God convicted me of my sin of unbelief. I don't think it was a sin for me to have insurance. But I think it was a sin for me to see the promises of God and say, that's not enough. I want something more. And we bowed our heads, and I confessed that to the Lord. And I said, Lord, I want to walk with you. I want to walk your way. And I called up Minnesota Care. They hadn't even gotten my check yet. And they said, what do you want us to do? And I said, if you could just shred it, I don't want to make you have any more expense, yada, yada. They said, so what are you going to do instead? And I tried to explain them to it. That didn't make any sense to them. They didn't understand. That was on a Friday. Monday, I came home from work, and I was getting that one of those colds, that your throat just hurts, your nose is running, and it's just... I come home, my wife greets me, and she wants to give me a kiss, and I'm saying, no, and she goes, come here, and she sits me down on the sofa. She goes, I got something for you. And I said, what? And she turned around, and she had her hands behind her back, and she reached around, and she handed me a $100 bill. And I said, what's this? And she said, someone heard that we had some medical expenses, and they wanted to help out. And I said, do we know who? And she says, no, they wanted to remain anonymous. And all of a sudden, it hit me. I knew I was the only one who knew what the total was. We were facing $1,000 of bills that we hadn't even gotten them yet. But I was facing a $1,000 bill, and nobody else knew that. Not even Amy at that time. And here was God giving me 10% of the bills before I even got the bills as a promise. And I said, all of a sudden, just that quick, God connected the dots in my brain. I was like, sweetheart, this is God's promise. This is what it is. And I said, we got to pray and thank God for this because this is a promise. He's going to provide for this. She said, well, just a minute. Here's another and another and another. It was $1,000. And I hadn't even gotten the bills yet. This story is not about insurance. The story is about a heart learning to trust God. And you could say, well, that just happens to you, Japheth, because everybody knows you. Well, not everybody knew me then, and people still don't all know me. But I think of David and Joy Hostetler. I could sit here and I could keep you busy probably for the next 3 hours telling you stories of people who were nobodies, who God has done this for. And I need to keep moving on. The second result of living this way is that it allows God to work in divine ways. His kingdom advances. When we give this way, when people see the impossible done, it points away from ourselves and it points towards our God. God does this. When they look at that and say, how in the world did you do that? It wasn't me. It was, well, yeah, you had, because people would keep asking me, how did you get your business to grow so much? And I said, it wasn't me. I never took any business school. I don't know anything. All I did was just simply try to live out God's principles and teach and work with other people. And it's grown. It's interesting to me that Jesus brought out this widow woman that came in and threw in 2 pennies. And I'd like to make this statement. You can push back on it when we're done if you want to, but God is not looking for those who are rich in this world to build his kingdom. But rather, he's looking for the soul who is rich in faith so he can pour himself through that person to the lost and the needy world that's around us. I think that's what he's looking for. And he needs us to be willing. And oftentimes it's our riches or the cares of this life that stand in the way of that, because we turn our eyes to those things instead of to him. Is Jesus Lord of my finances? The third benefit of doing this is that, as I talked about before, it allows us to see God's provision firsthand. And I think that is so important for us and for every generation. My parents walked in faith. They saw this lived out. But you know what? Until I was willing to do it, it didn't really become mine. It was still someone else's faith. But once you do that, then God's faith is able to become real. It's personal for me. If you read the story of the basket of flowers, remember her father died, and she's life is terrible, and she goes, God, I've seen the faith of my father, but God, I can't live with my father's faith. I need it real for me. I need to know that you're there. And this is one way that is doing it. And the fourth result of living this way is that it is often criticized by the faithless. I have had some people push back really hard against these things because it doesn't make sense earthly. And there's a phrase that says that some people are so heavenly minded to the no earthly good. I think the opposite can also be said. When we're so earthly minded, we may be no heavenly good because we're not willing to take our eyes off of that to see what God may want to do. I need to keep moving on. The third one is submission. And 1 Peter 5:5 says this, likewise, you younger, submit yourselves to your elders. Yea, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So I'm going to make a statement, and you guys all can do this is yes, and this is no. Okay? All right? I want you, and then this is like, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm just going to ride the fence, and let me tell you, it gets uncomfortable for a while. Okay? All right? So I'm going to make a statement, and you go yes or no. All right? I am not more important to God's kingdom than anyone else in this room. I'm speaking about Japheth. Japheth is not more important to God's kingdom than anyone else in this world, or this room. Yes or no? Some of you are looking around. True, that's exactly right. I am not. And that's important to remember. None of us are more or less important in God's kingdom. And how do I know that? Well, I know there are some of you in here that could teach me things. And I think probably if I sat down with each one of you, you'd be able to show me some things that I don't know. My children teach me. And sometimes my grandchildren are teaching me. That I see things through their lives. They have no clue they're teaching me yet. But God is using them to speak to me. You know, we are all part of one body. And while we're all equals, we still need leaders. So, Dietrich, who's more important in your home, your dad or your mom?
Daddy.
Why is that?
Leader.
Okay. Does that make him more important? I put you on the spot, and I'm sorry. That is exactly what I've oftentimes thought, that the one who's in leader, the one who's in charge, is more important. And that's what our world does think, right? That once you get a position of authority, then all of a sudden, ooh, now you're important. And they call climbing the ladder, climbing the level of importance, getting up there. In marriage, neither one is more important. I actually went and I looked up watched a guy with a team of horses that he had trained well, and he was plowing with it. And he had the reins around his shoulders, and so he has to keep his hand on there, and sometimes you got to reach up and grab one of the reins, a little something like that. But he did everything else but voice in that. But in a team of horses, when they're pulling together, you need to have a dominant horse, a lead horse, and you need to have a submissive horse. And they both hear the master's voice, but many times the reins only go to one. They go to the lead horse. And the follow horse, the submissive horse, waits for the other to make the first step. But they both can start and stop. When they go to make a turn, he might give the command, and they wait for the other horse to take that first step. I watched a few videos to try and see if I could tell which was the dominant horse, which wasn't, and I couldn't tell. And the videos were up close, so you could see the horses, you could watch their ears twitch, you could see, I couldn't tell. That's the picture of what a husband and wife should be. Two people pulling together so in unity, and the reins may go to one, and one may be the leader, but they still pull together in harmony so that they know that they're together. While God has called some of us to lead, and he will some of you as well, we're still part of the same body, and we need to be willing to live with submission in our hearts towards each other. Submission is oftentimes a dirty word in our society. It feels like you're being underneath the authority, underneath the thumb of someone. And even sometimes in our churches that way. If I submit to the leaders of my church, then somehow I'm giving up my individuality. Somehow I'm giving up my right to be right. And yet I believe submission is a vital part of the true Christian's daily walk. I think it is absolutely vital for us to learn this. So what are we talking about when we say submission? Well, it's exercising Gelassenheit. And Gelassenheit is that German word that there isn't any direct translation into English from it. But Paul Miller from down in Kansas said this. He said, it's the desire to accept with submission to God, joyful abandonment to God and his plan for me. It's the desire to accept with submission to God, joyful abandonment to God and his plan for me. It's the full surrender, that abandonment. You see a house that's been completely devoid of people in it for a while, and it starts to collapse. It's an abandoned house. It looks like a sorry shape sometimes. But that's where there's nobody there anymore. And that's where there's nothing of us there. It's completely abandoning ourselves to God and his path for me. Submission is not forced from above, but freely chosen. Those in leadership, whether it be your parents at home, your boss at work, the leaders of the church at church, they can ask for, and sometimes they can demand obedience. When children are little, we don't wait for them to voluntarily choose. Sometimes we say, no, you have to learn to obey now. They can ask for demand obedience, but submission is only freely chosen by the individual. A little boy was being cantankerous, and he was kicking dirt in the garden. His dad was trying to plant a garden, and he kept kicking the clods of dirt, and it was getting in people's faces. And finally, he said, tried to get him to stop. He wouldn't stop. Finally, he says, go sit on the porch. So the boy goes over to the porch, but he found a squeaky board, and he starts stomping on the squeaky board, and he's stomping around. His dad said, I said to sit down on the porch. But he sat down, and he looked up at his dad. I might be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. He needed a bottom warming, okay? Let's just say that. But the reality is, was he obeying? Outwardly, he was sitting down. But he was not submitted. He was not submissive. Submission is freely chosen by the people. It is recognizing grace and submission is recognizing grace and truth at work in our leadership as it leads the body. You know, we leaders are not infallible. Let me just tell you right up front. We're normal. We put our pants on one leg at a time, just like all the rest of you men do. We have struggles with anger. We have struggles with fear, and we have other things just like everyone else does. We're not infallible. But it's recognizing that while God has called us to lead, he's also called us to learn as well. And it's giving grace for us to make some of those mistakes, to learn as we go that we need. You know, it's just like, Wayne and Hannah are going to get married. We've been married for 25 years, and some of you are way beyond that, and some of you are in between there somewhere. Do you have to extend grace to each other to learn in marriage what it means to be married? Yes. We're still doing that. And it's a good ongoing process because it's bringing about holiness in our lives. We're learning those things. You know, when you're single, when you're a child, you have to remember my relationship is between me and God or between me and my parents. But now all of a sudden, when you get married, it's between we and God and we and our parents. And what the actions that you do really affects the one that you're with. Ooh. And you never realized how selfish you were until you got married. And then all of a sudden you start finding out all the things that you really liked and you really thought were important that they don't. And just like that couple has to learn to extend grace to each other to grow, so does the church and the leadership need to extend grace to each other. The church needs to extend grace to the leadership because we're still learning, and we need to extend grace to the congregation. It's a submission there. Number 4 is a submission of all to all. And this strikes at the heart of today's individualism. I read 1 Peter 5:5 at the beginning about likewise young people submit yourselves to your elders. But I love the last part of this. For God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. In other words, if I face something in church that I'm not willing to submit to, my resistance against that, my fighting against that, is not just resisting that issue. It's actually starting to resist God. And that's sobering. That is really, really sobering. I am not accountable for how others choose to respond to me, but I am accountable for how I respond to them. Submission is willingly granting the right of qualified, experienced, and appointed men to exercise leadership in the body of Christ. Most people do not want to be put in a position of leadership. You know, if you have 16 people that are 16 young people and they all want to play volleyball, but no one wants to take leadership, how long does it take to get a game started? Okay? And what are they doing? None of them want to be the person who steps out and does it. Because there's that hesitation for it. But yet if someone does, the game happens and it transforms and it can quickly move on and you have structure that comes from that. Submission is recognizing that God has called leaders there and surrendering my individuality to their guidance of our body as a whole. I got to keep moving here. Submission is doing what I do not feel like doing. That's when it's tested. And it's not just doing it, it's doing it with a willing heart. I'm going to tell you right this. Submission is not learned or tested when we agree. Submission is learned and tested when there's disagreements. And that is the hard part. And I remember when Chester Weaver said this the first time, and I kind of was a cold cup of water of reality. He said this: submission is probably the strongest indicator of the actual presence of Christ in a group. That if you want to see how much of the Spirit of Christ is in a body of believers, find out how well they submit to each other. And when it's there in abundance, and there's that grace that's there, he said, I know the presence of Christ is there. And I'd say it's almost the same thing in the home as well. So what are the results of practicing submission? Well, Well, the first result is spiritual prosperity for the group as a whole, because it increases our continuity. When we lay down our pride and our right to be right, it provides the grease and the gears that help us be able to extend that grace to each other, to recognize that other people might have something better to say than what I do. We can learn from other people, and it can cause us to move smoothly with other people, otherwise with people we would grade against naturally. And I think that was really, this has been something that I have struggled with learning. But through my work at the Pregnancy Center and several other places, it has really taught me to the willingness to lay down some of my preferences for the good of the group as a whole in that. Another result is that there's order and respect in the body. I've shared this before, but C.S. Lewis in his latter years went back to Catholicism. And one of the main reasons, there was 3 reasons that he gave, but one of the main reasons is that in his years of walking with Protestants, they had a lack of respect for the house of God and a lack of respect for their leaders. That everyone was, while they were attending these churches, it was still pretty much everyone doing was right in their own eyes. And he says, that's not right. He says, there needs to be submission in that. Third benefit of practicing submission is that it builds servant leaders, not drivers or controllers. So when leaders listen to the advice of their people, they're willing to hear their hearts and stuff, it builds a trust and a relationship with them that would never be there if they had forcefully taken control. And by doing so, it helps the leader not be in the place of domineering or forcing that control. For instance, some of these stories I've shared before, but when Amy was asking me to have family devotions, and I had 12-year-olds and I had 2-year-olds, how do you have family devotions that is engaging for all of them and feeds my wife? And that was a conundrum that I just couldn't seem to get past. And so for many years, I didn't do much of anything. We would have it occasionally, but it was just sporadic. And there was a time as my wife would be, honey, please. And it almost felt a little bit like nagging. But I remember when she chose to just cheerfully do what she was called. She would say, you know what, I'll just read something to them in school, but I'm not going to force my husband to do this. And when she did that, all of a sudden God started bringing screws. And let me tell you what, God's screws are bigger than your wife's screws or your husband's screws. He can put pressure like nobody else. And all of a sudden it came to the place I realized I need to do this. And when the biggest hindrance was just starting. I can go on. But by her being willing to be submitted and not continuing to nag, it allowed God to put the pressure in there and to bring the real change. The fourth benefit of practicing submission is that it fosters second and third generation loyalty. Children are great imitators. And sadly, they are sometimes, because they hold up a mirror that I don't necessarily like what's in the mirror, and I want to break the mirror, but the mirror doesn't change anything. If they see us as parents living in joyful, submissive harmony with the church, it sets the example for them to follow. And that is so critical. What do they see from us as normal? But the opposite is also true. If they hear derogatory words towards leadership, oh, that's just them. They're just saying that because they're in leadership. And they don't want us to, we don't have to do that. Or they hear, they see their parents doing whatever they please with complete disregard. They say, Daddy, Pastor talked about that in church. He says we're not supposed to be doing that. Why are we doing that? And you brush that off, they hear that. When they hear, don't tell the preacher this, they imitate those things as well, and they learn secrecy and things like that. And I don't have time to go in and tell the story about the church school being built, but we've shared that before. You can ask me about that later if you want. The fifth benefit of practicing submission is that it nurtures humility, graciousness, and respect within the body. When we are submitted to each other and when we practice submission, when we see other people cheerfully submitting, it causes a positive peer pressure to do what's right and build up. I watched that in Japheth's group of boys down boys camp. You know, when the chief was going to say, "Hey, we got to do something," and some of the boys going, and other ones go, "Hey, you know what? No, that's not what we want to do. Let's just do it anyways. And the sooner we do it, the better attitude, we'll get through it fine." And they start getting on, and the others are kind of like, but now all of a sudden they quit their grumbling, and they just started doing it. And before long, there was a really good attitude in the whole group because of the willingness of a few to lead out in that. Ladies, I just want to say, your role, is oftentimes when it's talked about in the roles of men and women is, calling you to be submissive to your husbands and respectful to them. And you get this because you've had to live that as you've studied Scripture. You've had to live that out. But men, I want to challenge us. It's just as vital for us too. In fact, I think it falls to us to lead by example. We care for our wives. We open the doors for them sometimes. We give them a coat when they're cold. I watched that during the hayride, not necessarily this last year because it wasn't very cold, but there's sometimes when that wind was a little chillier than someone. I watched men take their coats off and give them to their wives. Why? Because they love them and care for them. And they're showing their children by example how to protect and care for their wives. Are we showing them by example what it means to be submissive to our leadership and the ones that God has placed over us? We can pave the way for our ladies by showing that we also, as men, are willing to live in joyful submission to the brotherhood. And the last one is it encourages leaders to lead. When I was ordained, there was a significant part inside of me that shrank back, that said, I want nothing to do with this calling. And a lot of it was because I had seen, and I know, that we Christians have a real reputation of crucifying our leaders. It's not pleasant when you have to lead in difficult times where people don't agree with you. Why would anyone want that job? I didn't want the job. But I've also seen, I'm grateful over the last 10 years, that it has been a lot of healing that has taken place in my life. And I'm also willing to say that, as we have worked through things here, I have seen submission and submissiveness here in our willingness to deal with some of the things that we've faced. And it is much more joyful now to be a leader than what I thought was possible at that time. Brothers and sisters, may we all live lives of submission so that it can be a joy for those who lead us and not a burden. May we empower them by our spirits to keep carrying on and to do it well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for these lessons. I thank you for these things that, Lord, strike at the heart so much of our fear, our of losing control, our desire for control, our individuality, our pride, and our security. And yet, Lord, you ask us to do these things not because you want to make things difficult for us, but because there's a joy and there is a reward that is far beyond our expectations. Lord, may we be willing to do these things in our daily lives this week and in my life, Lord. Would you help me to practice these in a new way? In your name we pray. Amen. Maybe just one verse of song, and then Daddy, would you mind closing?